All right, in this video, I'm going to be working a little bit differently and take a break from drawing figures. I don't know about you, but I tend to get kind of burned out drawing figures all the time. It's fun and it's a challenge, but burnout is sometimes a real thing, and it's difficult to always push yourself to do the same thing constantly, especially if you're like me and you're teaching and you're doing everything with figure kind of 40 hours a week. To kind of get out of those ruts, I take interest in things that are new and, try to still see them through the same filter or, lens that I would try to appreciate drawing the figure. But for me, that's usually coming back to just focusing on like whatever the fundamentals of drawing are and try to appreciate it over again in a different way. Lately, what I've been doing is just, taking long dog walks. And then finding one thing every week that I really enjoy that stands out, or one thing a day, could be whatever, a couple things a week, and then try to draw it, something new. In a way, I think this is like a way to re-engage with the basics. So I've done a couple of videos on like basics, building your foundation, getting comfortable with like straight, C, S curve, boxes, spheres, cylinders, as a way to start to enjoy interpreting again. So like, saw this, or weeds, or whatever it is that catches your eye, and then try to think of ways that you might take an interest in designing it, right? So like if I look at a leaf, maybe like the top one here, how would I begin to interpret that? If I just take a moment to think about the basic components and how they might start to facilitate an understanding of that. So I would make a plane, or I would try to see this as a series of planes. So maybe that whole leaf, if I enveloped it, kind of put one of these, 3 shapes or structures around, provides a foundation for it. And then maybe inside I'll start to see, so that would look like it's planes that are folding. So maybe it's the idea of trying to understand and play around with the ribbon principle. And like, how could I start to take planes and then begin to fold them? But I think this is a really fun way to just make different choices and appreciate different components of your drawing process without it always needing to be like an arm, a head, a figure, and then all the judgment that comes along with that. You have new ways to think of like fun and engaging, different approaches or relationships to your process. So if it is a plane like this, and maybe I start to kind of add that quality to certain areas. Like I'm using line now to push down on that plane. That's how I'm thinking of it. And maybe this is a new way for me to start to think about gesture. Like here's the striation and the vein and the different patterning around the leaf. Maybe from that central point, I'm just going to build out a relationship to kind of the design of the way the different segmentations in the leaf develop. And so that's an opportunity to think about it, designing something different that might be the figure. What is the radial pattern at which these kind of develop out? And then when I make these types of patterns, I want to think about asymmetry between the ways that I've pulled that, right? So that's not, in other words, it's not constant like spokes on a wheel. Maybe I look for areas that have large, medium, small, or big, medium, small, or different percentages that start to think about an engaging way of learning about this design. Right, so there's another one here, and then maybe I start to add some curves, to soften the straighter. It's easier to start with a straight line, but to develop more, specific qualities to this, I'll just reintroduce curve on top. So I'm going to look at S and C, and then maybe I could start to vary that line like I am now to create texture. I might hold off on that, but I think here the C or the S might be to kind of break in and out. And now what am I doing? I'm using kind of back to that principle, trying to bring in that ribbon So I started to think about kind of pushing down into the plane, and now I'm thinking about how to create these undulating ups and downs. So all of this would be stuff that's directly applicable to figures. But if you're like me, maybe you just get, how do you re-engage with drawing after you've been burn out or tired of the same study, or you're drawing figures for 20 plus years and you just need occasional breaks to make the experience or the act of drawing feel fresh again. Sometimes you just need to rest, right? Sometimes you just need a long break from drawing anything at all. Like that, I think, is a very real thing. And that's why I have a lot of different interests in the arts, or art history degrees, fine art degrees. It's a good way to not get super burned out because you always shift your interest to somewhere else.
This content is brought to you by Steve's Teaching. If you'd like to learn more, he has courses on figure construction, head construction, and gesture drawing. In it, he goes through his step-by-step process and goes through everything he knows about those subjects, and he uses the curriculum that he teaches at places like Art Center or LCAD. You're getting the exact same information that he would normally be teaching, but at a fraction of the price. If you'd like to consider checking that out, please check out the links below in the description. Thanks, and back to the episode.
In a way, you could think of this as like the form, maybe like form logic, or it could be the form language of the plant you're drawing. And every time you approach a new subject or a new plant, you could try to think of a different form language. Form language meaning, how would I take these 6 basic elements and then arrange them into something that is not a series of lines and shapes? That's hard, but it's fun. It's more like a puzzle. And it's basically what we do with the figure, or it's basically what I always do with the figure. But with figures, it's just it gets old, right? Because there's such a demand for wanting it to look like an eye or a face that it just feels like there's more pressure. This is something that I've been doing lately that I really enjoy. And that's the hard part of burnout, right? Is can you find anything to enjoy again if you're really overworked, or you feel like you're in a rut with your own drawings? Taking classes, from different people, trying to get a sense of how other people approach something, kind of opening yourself up to something new, I think is a good way to break with that. So the other thing I might add, if I were to approach this, and sometimes this is enough. Like maybe I don't need to sit down and do a drawing of the plant to be satisfied with re-engaging with drawing. Maybe sometimes the fun part for me is just, can I figure out what the basic building blocks would be of the subject? Like, this is a plane with a series of ribbons and that I've added curves to. And then what else would I add to that? Well, I need to add cylinders because there's, branches and smaller forms that would be the centers to the leaves. And so I know I'm going to have this. So I kind of taken cylinder and kind of thought that through. And then what else would I need? I'd need to understand, we kind of magnify this a little bit down here. I need to understand a principle of form intersection, so that in areas like this area, for example, there's the stalk or the branch that's building off the other one. So form intersections, by the way, are the number one thing in an anatomy or life drawing or whatever it is, head drawing, that people always struggle with the most. So if I can, let's say I'm at a stage in my drawing with anatomy where I'm really struggling with kind of holding all of the sculptural elements or pieces of a form together. Now I've done my gesture and my construction, and I'm adding muscles on top, and it's just starting to feel wobbly. I would always say it's this. So how do I come back and think about connecting one form to another and getting those wraps and overlaps so I feel like one thing does have that solid connection and bridge? Maybe it's a good time to just come work on that at a simple subject like this. Like you're just thinking about your form intersections in a tree or a leaf or a flower you like, and it makes it a little bit easier to connect with that skill and build it up before coming back to something stupid like an arm or a nose. Right, so that would be the things that I would start to look and organize this subject around. And then maybe you just pick an area. Like maybe I'm just going to pick, when I look at this from here to here. But those are the only parts that are really interesting to me. And so I might start with a gesture in a little different way. So how could I reinterpret gesture for this? Well, maybe gesture for me would be that there's that central stalk that is holding all of it up. And then, like I began with here, I'm going to do my planes for leaves, the leaves. But I'm going to organize them and try to develop an appreciation for their design as they sit, kind of exist around that. I could add some kind of smaller gestures in here. But I'm keeping it very much about trying to enjoy this, the lay-in, the shapes. I'm not going to contour it. Nothing wrong with that. I think that would be not as much fun for me, but it depends on your, what you like. If you want to sit down and contour this, or sit down and direct draw it, that's fantastic. My preference is always, I love thinking about the abstract properties of drawing and how we can kind of break things down into the component parts. So part of this exercise might just be about coming back to and reconnecting with what you love about drawing without a lot of judgment around it, self-judgment or otherwise. So in this, maybe I think about what is the flow, the compositional flow of shape to, the breakup of space, negative and positive. Like I'm moving, attempting to move the eye down. Maybe I think about just as much about negative shape as I do positive shape here. There's another kind of working down to that larger. But so what am I working on in terms of competency? I'm working on line and mark making and the control. I'm working on planes and perspectives, right? So that I'm not just seeing this all the time. What you can see in my planes is that, I'm practicing leaning planes away. So I'm not seeing the box, in other words, straight on, the plane straight on. That by letting the lines converge, that I'm starting to push that into space by angling it in different ways. So that's kind of helpful to still be skill building and enhancing the way that you think about your technical language while appreciating a new subject. And then maybe the form language is that you understand the components of what make, this natural form feel real, so that you could remember the patterning or the sequence of form and shape, and then that becomes your foundation for invention. So you only have to draw so many of these before you develop a familiarity. And I think that's what most people seem to want nowadays, is just drawing things from their head without a lot of buildup. And then I think as I get to the bottom, I start to make these more dense so that they have and maybe the composition is that this kind of groups and then begins to slow the eye down more. But I think that's about good for me. I don't know how much more I'd want to do, but that would give my whole kind of form a lay-in or a way to develop. And then back to here, where's the center? How am I creating the different shapes within that larger plane? I think you're going to still focusing on that radial pattern. Right? Maybe I'll just work up this one. Here's an S curve. And then I know what most people are probably thinking, well, when do you light it? Because lighting, we need the light as soon as possible. There's a lot of love of light rendering. Whenever you want. But I think that you need, my only thing is, I'm tired of looking at light and shadow drawings that I have no idea what they're lighting. So that's I think the biggest dilemma for students is when there's a light and shadow rendering, people love to render the light, but generally they have no idea what surfaces they're lighting. So remember, the most important formula is that value equals surface. You're not going to see light and shadow effects unless there's a change in surface. So my teaching is mostly what are the surfaces that we're seeing, because kind of the biggest problem is that people are lighting too much from a photo. They're relying too much on a reference without knowing what it is that's happening. But if I know that there's, a folding plane, like let's take, for example, this part of the leaf, if I know this part of the leaf, so let's say from here to here, is rolling at that tempo because I've done, or is rolling at that surface timing or cadence. Tempo sounded weird. I know how to light that. I know the basic idea for lighting that. That is, that's a cylinder, and a cylinder should be lit with kind of a firm edge. So I know to time that more abruptly than I would a sphere, but not as sharp as a box. And then done. And then I don't need to, stare at it forever and try to copy what's there. And then what's happening next? Well, because light's blocking, I get a cast shadow onto the next part of the leaf. And so that will be treated differently. I'll use a different edge. So I'm using the same principles of lighting I would in a figure. It's, my 4 edges, soft, firm, hard, and lost. And then kind of basing the way that those work on the 8 conditions of light. Okay, but it's all about timing for me. Tried to time the surface. Or maybe you just, if possible, maybe you just like a nice line and texture drawing. Maybe you don't want to make everything chiaroscuro. And we want to practice no-tan, the development of pattern, texture, and kind of larger blocks of value. That's a good exercise. Can you make a nice line drawing that feels beautiful without value? Like this leaf is interesting over here. Start to move around. There's a different pitch or kind of drop in the plane. Like, so if I compare this one out, maybe that's like somewhat conical. Or it's a plane that might be more conical if I start to really push the perspective sense. Well, this one's even more so. So now I'm trying to think about that being pushed lower down. Almost flowery, but not quite. And then look how this has a really interesting wobble or wave pattern. That's like in drapery, we would describe that as a pipe fold. I think it's possible also to get kind of to study subjects for so long, like in this case, my case, figures, but you need to look at something else to get excited about it, but you can always take that understanding with you. So maybe I see a lot of figurative design in nature, or I can come to reappreciate designs in drapery or figure by a kind of comparative extension to nature. I don't feel like any of these ever need to be like dialed in and finished though, right? Like I was saying earlier, you could have the drawing as a whole just live in the land of form language, right? Or the logic of your forms and your lines. So this one might be like I do like to do little maps. I do this a lot for drapery. If you watch any of my videos, I do maps of all the muscles quite often, quite frequently, to plan their shapes and their designs before I include them. So I think that's what I'd be doing here, like a quick sketch. This would be, a different way of thinking and having fun. What is the form logic? How would I use that to break down what I see and then appreciate it from the standpoint of how I might develop it up? And this is, how would I get the whole thing up and off the ground? So maybe I'll just work through a few of these, but I'm not going to really sit down and do like a long texture rendering. That would be later, I think. Or if I were going to start to do that, I would want to say, how would I develop texture? There's no way to I'm not going to make a brush and then scatter it here. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to do it. So I'd have to find an equivalent language that feels leaf-like in my mark making, which might be fun. Like maybe it's, that I did up here. Maybe I use like a more irregular line, or I push pen pressure from dark to light, right? And kind of scatter, or I start making some marks that are more hatched in some areas, or like in this example, maybe a little bit more shiny, sharp, outlined to communicate that slick, smooth surface that gets the sheen across it and the leaf. Right, so that's mostly it. Just kind of something different than what's usually up here in terms of ways to be hyper organized and technical with drawing figures. This is just kind of coming back to a practice where we might think about re-engaging with fundamentals, thinking about things that are new, different, fun for presenting a new challenge. And then a couple ways, just sharing with you a couple ways that I try to break out of feeling burnout or not overwork, but maybe over appreciation, spending too long with a subject, kind of experiencing the act and practice of drawing again.